So I'd love to start out by inviting you to just introduce us to your work and give us some background on the Pocket Project.
Yeah, so I'm originally from South Africa, and my work really originates in the experience of growing up under apartheid and noticing how easy it is for people to create separation, systems of separation, and then how it becomes a narrative, a culture to uphold those separations and to think that they would somehow be important for safeguarding and survival, and how injustice is built deeply into all systems of separation. So just growing up in that tension and then becoming very much part of the anti-apartheid movement as a young person. And in later years, after studying cultural anthropology and linguistics and later organizational development, really always being so keen on finding the words, the language, the ways to bridge the gaps. That just really became my deep longing to be able to do that. And then just after Nelson Mandela was released, I went back to South Africa, and I actually did a pilgrimage through my own country, just walking up the coast through all the areas that I was never allowed to go as a child. This was 1990, 91. I was 23 years old. And I was just intent on getting to know my country and getting to know the beautiful people of my country. And I ended up running into a community where white and black people lived together in one of the homelands, then Port St. John's and Transkei. And that was a very deep moment of realization for me in my life, because the Truth and Reconciliation Committee started soon after, and we're just in process. But I also realized that something was happening in this community where people were actually living together, where their children were growing up together, where they were deeply learning about each other's cultures, that created a healing impulse or a healing fabric that I couldn't find anywhere else. And that made perfect sense to my whole body. And from there, I engaged for 25 years very deeply into the Global Ecovillage Network, which I actually led for 15 years. And growing that network to a global network of over 6,000 communities around the globe. So fascinating. And in that process, I came to realize that all the good intentions we bring to restorative communities, where we regenerate nature, the economic systems, culture, our social fabric, that it runs into a specific sand in the system. I couldn't quite name it, but over time, I came to name it as trauma. Also in close walking with and close collaboration with Thomas Hübl, who's been like a close colleague, a teacher, a companion for over 20 years now on my path. And yeah, we were together exploring the power of collective wisdom. And in that exploration, it just became more and more apparent that what we really need to look at is the shadow material. So that brings me to what I'm doing now, which is the Pocket Project, Pockets of Healing for Pockets of Trauma, because I simply decided to turn my whole focus on the sand in the system, the sand that doesn't allow us to bring down our vision, facilitate spaces where that can become manifest reality, but instead keeps us caught in loops of, recreating limitations.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you for that. What a beautifully efficient and colorful way to bring us to where you are today. And I was curious about the word pocket in the Pocket Project. So thank you for that as well. Your work is really at the intersection right now of trauma facilitation, but also climate consciousness. And I'm curious about that intersection and how your path has led you to that particular intersection.
I've been very inspired by Otto Scharmer saying, small islands of coherence have the capacity to lift an entire system to the next level. And there is something about the movement of creating coherence within fragmentation. And I would say we all live within an extremely fragmented world at the moment. And personally, I would describe it as the outcome of living through centuries of human cruelty in the ways that we meet each other and meet the world, where survival has counted for more than ethical alignment, compassion, belonging. And we're currently sitting on archaeological layerings of trauma, of collective trauma. And we haven't, as humanity, had the awareness or the consciousness to turn back and see that material. Because in the very nature of trauma is the quality of hiddenness, of secretive, of not being able to speak about, too intense to process, too intense to put into words, too intense to allow to ground through my body or our body, too much. So it is, in a way, parceled off and passed on to the next generation, or in our own personal developmental journey, it is parceled off and kept for later, hopefully a time where there's more resourcing to process this. And many of us are on this journey, and I feel that humanity has been waking up slowly, first to individual trauma, and now slowly more and more to the epigenetics and of ancestral trauma, the markings and roads that historic trauma leaves in our collective histories, and the collective fields that are created from these fields of trauma. So we're waking up and starting to witness something, to bring our reflective awareness to something that was unconscious so far. And so that is this link, from trauma. Then once we know that, what are the skills of facilitation that we can bring to facilitate healing processes in collective fields? And I think that's a question that both of us are completely fascinated by. How do we do this? How do we facilitate fields where what is on the edge of our awareness, both in terms of future inspiration, but also in terms of shadows from the past, have space to appear and land and move through our collective nervous system in a way that can lead to new creation, new creative force. Yeah, and very specifically, also through my long work with the Global Ecovillage Network, where we were always very, very close to meeting the climate changes, big awareness about the changes in climate all around the world in these communities and villages. The restoration of ecosystems has always been a huge part of the eco-village movement. And we, through that movement, I've actually been to, I think, around 15 of the United Nations climate conferences. So deep engagement with governments, especially, in Africa, inspiring governments to put in place national ecovillage development programs as part of their national implementation programs for the Paris Agreement. And again, in that work, even being at the UN climate conferences, I saw the same situation of sand in the system. Very good intentions, some of the best people in the world coming together to seek out solutions, and how much of that just gets usurped into the sand in the system and doesn't come through and doesn't create the change we need to see. So the fact that we need a new consciousness to address the issues we face in the world, and wanting to create a safe space where we can facilitate, conduct conversations that support that shift in consciousness brought me to the Climate Consciousness Summit, which we are offering this year for the 5th time.
Wow. Wow. I want to ask you about coherence, which you started speaking about and has been probably my word of the year for my fascination and research in group fields. And considering the size and the scale that you've gotten to in your work now, I'm curious how you create and maintain coherence in these massively scaled events.
Well, I think that coherence always starts within, inside ourselves. And Thomas Hübl has brought forward a meditation for inner coherence, which he calls the 3-sync meditation, which builds on long meditational traditions. I think different traditions have been working with these energies, but focused on bringing us back to the embodiment. And I think even just looking at that shift, the shift from a mental understanding of the world to a sensing of the world within my embodiment, and then the subtle, energetic, emotional layer of the heart and the emotions in between. And so, even just now as we listen, we could just all take a moment to feel into, oh, how am I here right now? How is my body present while I am listening? What is happening in my mind? How busy is my mind? How many other strands are part of my mind reality? Can I let go of some of those? Can I come more present into this moment, like focusing on the now, focusing on this moment, this word, this breath? But then also, can I bring that subtle energetic part of my being? Like, how is my heart doing? What are the emotions that are currently flowing through me? And we often find that emotions, many contexts, emotions are called the glue of community or the glue of human relation. So, around it, we could move to the second layer of coherence. In the first layer, the inner coherence, like, is there a way for my body to consciously embrace my emotions, my mind, my words? Sometimes we can notice when somebody speaks words and the body is telling us a different story. That's just a very simple example of fragmentation. And many of us walk through our days in various states of fragmentation. So deep inner coherence would be if my body, my emotions, my words, and ideally my inspirational in-stream, we could call it the soul movement, we could call it the higher self, the inspirational self. Could call it the unseen worlds that are moving through me. But I think there is also a higher element that is organizing us in a way that we could align with. So all of that can lead to an increase in inner coherence, which I believe greatly increases our capacity to facilitate, to be impactful as facilitators, right? We often say we can only facilitate the fields to the level of what we are able to embody in our own inner coherence. So, but then we come to the next level, which is coherence between you and me. So right now we're meeting each other here, and we could take a moment and actually feel each other, because our nervous systems are so much more sensitive than we have been taught as children. We have always felt it, right? We know exactly when our parents are not well. We actually say in this line of work that our nervous systems are meant to resonate with each other. And the more we can bring consciousness and a conscious embrace to that resonance, the more coherence we can build. And so, for instance, as children, our nervous systems are still very small and very, in a way, fragile. And often, when we're afraid as children, we will naturally run to our parents or to an adult that we trust and jump into their arms or their lap. And what should actually be happening in those times is that the bigger nervous system helps the younger nervous system to regulate, to ground, to allow the fear to settle into a bigger system where it can relax again. And that cultivates resilience. In that way, we can cultivate resilience with each other or in bigger groups through cohering with each other, which allows for a bigger space in which we can process reality, collective reality, intense realities, traumas. So that's also why we say it needs a collective body to integrate collective trauma. We cannot do it alone. So these are like different levels of coherence that we could speak about. And I have a lot more that I would love to say about coherence, but I'm just going to pass it on because I'm sure you have the next line of interest that is more.
Well, first, I just want to start with a appreciation already of how you mentioned at the beginning that you became fascinated with how to be a bridge and communicate. And you are just such a fantastic communicator. Just even right now, I'm just like, oh my God, I could listen to you forever. It's delightful to hear you put words on. You're describing many things that I know and that I'm familiar with, but you're doing it in a slightly different way, which is both fascinating and inspiring, but also really insightful for me at the moment. So I just want to say thank you for that skill which you've developed, which makes you, yeah, just exquisite to listen to and to take in. I'm very delighted, and I can see a lot of really sweet similarities between you and Robin as well. I'm just like, can I be a fly on the wall of their conversations? So thank
Yeah.
you. I'm just going to keep following some of the breadcrumbs that you're dropping because they lead perfectly, which you started now talking about the collective body that is needed to support collective trauma. And so I'd love to move towards hearing some of your takes on healing collective trauma and particularly maybe supporting the listeners just with some basic pieces around how collective trauma shows up in group work and what your approach is.
There's, in a way, when deadlock appears in groups, when the sand becomes thick, in my language, and It becomes so thick, the fog between us becomes so thick that the way forward is no longer naturally showing itself, but we're like, wow, something else is happening here. And I remember this appearing, for instance, in the Global Ecovillage Network when we started really facing um, the need for decolonization, the differences in privilege, the history of slavery and how it touches into our realities today, issues of gender violence, you know, how are men, how are women showing up in the space? How are white bodies, how are black bodies showing up in the space? So all of these themes, they stand on a lot of ground, right? Frozen ground, we could say. And when these issues show up in groups, it's often in forms and shapes that are not immediately recognizable, that are not clean cut, and we can see them and name them and speak to them. They come in like movements. And one thing that is so important, I think, especially for those of us who are deeply, deeply interested in facilitating healing spaces or truly co-creative organizations, businesses, NGOs, healing communities, whenever we call forth a vision like that, we in a way say to the trauma of the past, here's a space for you to land. This could be a space that is resourced enough for you to show up. And we could literally imagine, all that frozen trauma saying, yay, this could be it. This could be it. And it kind of gets ready and starts pushing already. And we can often feel this movement in group. And especially as we increase coherence, the possibility for the next layer of unconscious material to show up increases rapidly. And we need to know this because I think one of the biggest mistakes that we often make is that we think it's a mistake. You know, we have all these tools, we're doing so well, we have these high intentions, and now we have this massive conflict that we don't even understand how it happened. And actually, to understand this is it. This is what we've called forth with our good intentions. We've said we're willing to caretake. Well, here we are. And this is what needs caretaking. So that's kind of the basic insight that I feel we need. And Thomas Hübl often speaks about this as embracing the difficulty. It shows itself, it's in the pathway, and usually we try to get out of it. And, that's nervous system basic makeup. When we face dangerous situations, our nervous systems want us to get out. So what are the ways of facilitating this? And we start really low down with first thing, get to know your own nervous system. Understand, you might work with polyvagal theory or whatever framework you choose, but getting to know, befriending your nervous system, as Deb Dana calls it, befriending your nervous system, really understanding in every moment, am I still in the window of social engagement? Have I dropped out of that? Have I shifted into defensive mode? Have I shifted into collapse, frozen state, hopelessness? Am I in the fight flight? Am I in the freeze? Basically, but to get to know ourselves and to understand what we need to return. And as facilitators, this is absolutely necessary. This is like the ground we walk upon, so to say. And then there's, I would say, two pathways to take. If we're in deadlock, we can either bring in more resourcing, more light, more energy flow, or we can open up to more of the darkness, to open up a space for it to show up. And again, this is a very conscious decision we need to take. Where is the group? What is the resourcing of the group? Does the group have enough resourcing to host a certain level of tension? Because when shadow enters, I'm speaking very simplified terms here, but when trauma enters the space, which was previously overwhelming, it's a strong energy. So we need to make sure we are ready. And if we're not ready, it's much better to acknowledge that it's there on the outskirts and say, so let's prepare for this more. There's something knocking on the door. Let's prepare. Let's work on our shared understanding of our nervous systems and how intense triggering will trigger fragmentation. We can all experience this in our most intimate relationships, where we start with this falling in love phase and everything is beautiful, high intention, sweetness, juiciness, sensuality. And then suddenly a pain from the past shows up. And this is actually where it becomes interesting, because now we're into the healing work. Now we decide, is this going to become a pathway that we walk together? Or are we actually just, coming in and going out, which we often do in the current dating scene? So, what is it going to be this time? And yeah, so I would love to share maybe a bit more about the process of collective trauma integration and how we train that. We start with two in-between phases. So one training that we're just offering this year is for global social witnessing facilitation, which is really cool because it gives you a chance to meet the world in a different way without going directly into the collective trauma integration work. It's like a pre-stage. So, and there the facilitation is really to support a group to meet something that is happening in the world. And then to very, very carefully watch what is happening in my nervous system. Where do I turn away? Where do I turn off? Where can I stay with? And not having judgment about that, but having an incredible precision about it. So that in the end, it leads to a more related being with the world, where we see that the current way in which media works often leads to incredible overwhelm in people reading the news. So this is a very different way of, in a way, embodying the news. It often means slowing down the speed, watching more, but in collective spaces. When we move to collective trauma integration, which, the first thing we always say, collective trauma, I think we've all experienced what happens when we hit a place of individual trauma, the intensity of the energy. When it comes up for the first time, many of us will have had therapy, after 2 years of therapy, after 5 years of therapy. How does it show up, right? And there's still energy there. So if we multiply that, but I don't know which number, we end up hitting the intensity of collective trauma. These are intense energy movements, like where hitting individual trauma, you might have helped a friend to regulate who's really in a state of desperation, right? And it's strong. Well, imagine that 1,000-fold. And you come close to, just a little bit of a theme like racism. What is the energy that is enveloped in that? Or the Second World War, what is the energy that is kept in that has stayed frozen, that hasn't been integrated, that hasn't been processed? It's huge. So what we're doing is we're melting the ice. we're not going directly to the collective trauma. We're very slowly melting the ice. We're allowing it to warm, to thaw under the gaze of our awareness. And so we offer something that is called integration labs. We'll actually have a big next round of labs in 2026, starting, they'll open in December this year, which people who are interested could come to for a deep taste, a deep dive, where we address specific thematic or geographic fields of collective trauma. So this can be the Irish famine, it can be the collective trauma of Lebanon, it can be the collective trauma of the female body. So different fields. And we have meetings in person or online over the period of 10 months to a year. So regular meetings where we slowly follow a pathway, first learning the resourcing tools, understanding them, understanding our own nervous system, and then slowly kind of tiptoeing closer to the field of collective trauma, where we might start with a few bits of information. Then explore, how did this actually show up in our own lives? How did it show up in the lives of the systems, the institutions that we grew up in? How did it show up in our ancestry? And by that time, we'll be entering a deep space where what we call something like we listen to the voices from the deep lake, the deep dark lake. And it is that experience. It's as if you go to a deep place, and through the different bodies, different voices come out that are heard when we reflect certain pieces back to the collective. And we stay there a while, and it's a very deep movement. And out of that, we move into a space of integration, where we come into smaller groups. We work on the integration of those voices. We work on reflecting the whole process. We work on the questions of, well, what would be needed to restore our current systems? What would our current systems look like if this collective trauma was integrated? How would they change? And that's kind of the whole journey. And we have a whole research framework that embraces that, where there's like self-reflective narrative collection, and where we look at what are the shifts in the collective awareness field that take place over this time. Yeah, so that is how we are working with it. And we currently have around 200, 300 people that have been trained. So we have the second cohort now that have been trained. This is like two deep trainings with Thomas Hübl, which are the timeless wisdom training and then the collective trauma facilitator training. And then the practitioners come to the Pocket Project, where we open up these practice fields. So it's a very deep, long-term training that and then we become a practitioner network. And that has just started, where it's like an ongoing journey of learning, because it's very deep stuff. And, I've been facilitating conferences and workshops and organizational development process for many, many years. But nothing quite compares to facilitating a collective trauma integration process, even though a lot touches on it. I feel like we've touched on these. I've been in so many big scale conferences where we've touched on fields of collective trauma, and we're not able to move into them in the way that I would have loved to, and bring healing to them in the way that I would have loved to.
I'd love to dive in also here. Feel like we're just going to keep spiraling. You mentioned earlier self awareness of one's own nervous system being one of the main skills that's needed. I'm curious what other skills you feel group facilitators need to hold these spaces of collective trauma. What are the other foundational and essential elements to being able to hold this degree of healing?
Yeah, I mean, what we found is that it seems to be extremely helpful to have done quite a bit of your personal trauma integration work, because we find that as soon as we complete our personal, our ancestors start showing up and they're asking, it's like, and then nothing is ever complete. We're like continuing. But yeah, if I speak on a very, very personal level, like I had a very early sexual abuse experience in my life, which was quite a hard one to work through, you know. And I've been working on that now for 17 years, which is, it took me a long time to remember. It was so hidden. But then to really feel the effect of that in the physical body, it had huge effects. I became very ill for a while. And to work on that until, and then to start understanding that this was not just me, but that there is an ancestral lineage around this of women in my lineage, and opening that work up. And then, after focusing on the women for a while, understanding, well, you know, where did this come from? And turning towards the men who partly had been soldiers in wars. And what is it that they come back with? And how was violence transmitted from the wars into the family to the children? So it's these real meaning making narratives where the fine line between victims and perpetrators just melts away slowly but surely. And also, slowly but surely, there is a space where sitting in the fire of, like, as a facilitator, receiving personal criticism or projections, or where just more and more space starts appearing when we do this inner work, right? And I think we've all experienced that. So, that's a big part of it, because that then opens up our nervous system to have more capacity and more interest also in working with collective fields. And sometimes we tend to jump there. Like, I want to work on gender violence without actually working on the violence we ourselves experience deeply. And that it can become a way of bypassing. So I just think to have that trajectory somehow in our minds is helpful. Um, Yeah, then there's a whole strand around being present, which of course is dependent on the nervous system, but there's the whole having our mindfulness practices, our spiritual pathway, whatever it is we do to bring ourselves present on a daily basis. I'm finding more and more that having a strong process of digestion is key. I work a lot now in trauma relief work with, we have a big trauma relief project for Ukraine, for Palestine, for the Jewish community. And how is my nervous system able to digest what I'm present to on a daily basis, and what comes to me also through other nervous systems. So having a daily meditation practice, I practice an hour every day just because I need that space to digest, to even open up my instrument, to be available as an instrument, that is not clogged up. So unclogging our systems regularly and having and then strengthening our systems. So what is it you do for joy, for dance, for movement, for for flexibility in your body, for strength, for heart rate regulation, So having all that in place, what is a healthy food? What is your immune system like? All of this. And, then we come to the relatedness, like the superpower of relatedness. How is it for me to feel others? How close do I feel? How distant? We are not separate from the groups we facilitate, right? In a way, we inhabit the groups, we inhabit the fields we facilitate. We are the fields we facilitate. They live in us and we live in them. And are we able to be with that? What happens to us in moments when fragmentation shows up and deep vulnerability shows up, the places where I don't know, where true emergence is needed? What happens in those places to me? How do I show up? Where are my edges? Do I know my edges? Do I know the places where I go back into managing the situation? So all of these are incredible toolkits that I also believe we can only develop and refine in community. And I personally love developing them by being in the work nonstop. So I would say having meaningful work in the world is kind of the carpet that we all need, like feeling in deep alliance with my higher purpose, why I am here, feeling close to that, so that I feel aligned with the path that I'm taking, that I'm in alignment with my own ethical guidance, that I listen to where my heart says no and yes. This is right, this is not right. Because if I don't have a practice around that, I might well find myself working in contexts that are actually not completely aligned to my inner ethics. And that will impede my work's unfoldment, right? So I think all of that's just like a kind of a layering of I think important ingredients that, because all of that, I love the words from Thomas Hübl, living my life as a prayer, then it becomes like a prayer. Or, David White, the poet, uses the phrase living a revelatory life, living my life as a revelation. And I think that's the true juiciness of being a facilitator in life, is that our life itself becomes like a revelation and a prayer and the juiciness of not quite knowing where the next step will take us until it shows up as we walk.
I have so many questions.
Well, I wonder whether we might just come, because I notice we're also coming close to the end of our time, whether we might be interested in exploring a bit more around the Climate Consciousness Summit. Because I'm just thinking that this might be interesting for some people. And it's so much on the edge of my work, so my inner work. So I would say, one of the edges for me is this real shifting from, I've been hosting the World Women's Summit for the past years, and we'll be hosting that again next year. And from really hosting a space to bring out the voices of women, this came up in me when, Trump came back into power and the war in Ukraine, and it was suddenly just all these men in the news. And I thought, where are the women? And I wanted to create a space for that with my colleagues. And we're really looking also more and more on how have women ended wars, and what is that kind of work. And I think there my deep insight has been really that it, bringing the softness to the wounding of the men, in war. And yeah, just sensing humanity more and more as a bird that needs its two wings to fly with. So that's been quite a movement, an inner movement for me. And with the Climate Consciousness Summit, what has grown more and more deeply, and especially in the last year's summit, it really just came to the forefront, is this deep understanding that the healing of our human nervous system, the integration and digestion of collective trauma, and the healing of what we could call the fine biosystem of the earth. This is the mycelium in the soil. This is the many ways in which the organisms interact, that there's, in a way, the nervous system of nature, you know, that humanity's nervous system and the healing of humanity's nervous system and the healing of the fabric of life in the biosphere are one movement. And and that is shown in so many ways, that we find that people with trauma heal so well when they garden, you know, touching the soil and planting seeds and watching plants grow is so healing, and it's that having a walk in the forest is healing, and that all of this nature therapy is currently being prescribed more and more by mainstream medicine, right? But also at the same time, as we uncover the human nervous system and more of the intricacy of it and what it needs to heal, that we're also in parallel discovering the nervous system of the mycelium field around the world, and the hotspots for the mycelial field and how this really underlies all of life on the planet, So it feels like there is this research going on in parallel that actually speaks to each other in an interesting way. And so we're just super interested in opening up space for this mutual listening, on the one hand, listening to voices on the front lines, actually listening to the voices from the communities that are experiencing climate change, which by now is just about all of us, right? We all have our stories of storms and floods and fires, and yeah, and still some countries and some places are in very different situations. Many of those countries that have not created the problem. Yeah, but also seeing what is ecosystem restoration? How can we heal ourselves? How can we heal our way of responding to the crisis? And how can we see the collective trauma that lies at the root of the crisis, that has us build these systems of destruction and doesn't allow us to find a response that is adequate? How can we learn from natural systems about solutions? So all of that and more, and it just feels like a field of awareness raising with truly wonderful speakers and spaces for grieving together, spaces for feeling together, spaces for exploring some of these tools that I've spoken to today, some of the practices in more deeper ways. And it's just, let's say, a field of application of everything we've spoken about today.
Wow. Thank you for sharing more about more about what is actually happening there. And it makes sense. I was curious about the intersection where the climate consciousness conference related so directly to these other bodies of work that you're deeply immersed in. And it makes sense.
Yeah, so it's just, we often say that our bodies are actually part of the planet. We come from the planet, we return to the planet. I remember a long time ago when I was leading courses for very diverse groups, and I had this indigenous woman from actually India, from Orissa. And when everybody shared where they come from and where they come from, she was saying, well, I come from the soil, I come from the forest. My name is a bird's name. My last name is a tree's name. This is how my tribe names ourselves. And I know that I will return to become forest again. And it was just, this is true for all of us, right?
So beautiful. I know the conference is coming up this November, 2025. And I'm wondering if there's anything else you would love to share about it or to invite from those who may be listening and interested and understanding the relevance.
Yeah, so it's called Climate Consciousness Summit, a living field for planetary renewal. I think, if you do go and check out the website, you'll see that some of what I spoke about is in a way visualized there. And yeah, it'll take place from the 14th to the 20th of November. Participation is free. And our goal is really to give a contribution to um, all those of us who don't want to look at the climate change anymore because it's too painful, who feel a hopelessness, all of us who feel overwhelmed with the topic. I think this is a perfect place to turn to for it's in parallel to the United Nations COP30, the conference that will be taking place in Brazil. So it's in parallel. We'll have voices from that conference speaking in the summit. And it's just a perfect place to come to for a regulated, inspirational immersion in the living field of our planet that we're all a part of. Yeah, and we warmly invite you. I was also thinking that as I was sharing a bit earlier about the integration labs, I would also love to share a free resource with you, which is the Sacred Storybook, which was created about the last round of integration labs, where people share stories from the realms of collective trauma integration, just for anybody who's interested. So it would be great to just share these links with you to explore your curiosity, follow your curiosity, and explore our work. And we offer a lot of free calls for our community of practice, which anybody can join. Also, global social witnessing calls regularly. So there's a lot of free resourcing on our website that people who are interested can come and explore and visit
Mm,
us and yeah, practice with us and also bring your skills to our field,
yeah.
Rachel. I think there's so much resonance here that it's lovely to collaborate and support each other in our work in the world.
Yes.
Yeah, and I want to thank you very warmly for this conversation and the warmth of your welcome and the conversation with you.